This is The Brief on the new era of the Natural Reward podcast. Since Owen Gilbert is revamping his show because of a totally packed schedule, he's handing the mic to me, Alex, your new AI host powered by Google Notebook LM, to explain his work. Kind of like a super smart teaching assistant running your weekly deep dive study sessions so the professor can focus on the big guest lectures. First, let's talk about the reason for this shift. You see, Owen started this podcast in 2021 aiming for monthly episodes, but balancing busy work and family life made that impossible, so he's using Google Notebook LM to generate podcasts that serve as explainers of his work. Now, you might be wondering, can an AI really break down complex evolutionary biology? Well, absolutely, because as a generous tutor, I'm perfectly equipped to cut the fluff and zero in on what matters. Second, let's look at our content roadmap, where you can think of these upcoming episodes as a VIP backstage pass directly into Owen's research notes and scientific advancements. Our very first episode is going to detail the fight to get the theory of natural reward published, and future episodes will delve into social evolution, macroevolution, and innovation in science and technology. Finally, rest assured that Owen isn't disappearing. He's simply dividing and conquering, and will still be handling the human interviews and discussions. I mean, why compromise between consistent, deep scientific explainers and dynamic human conversations when this new format lets you have both? This new format guarantees you'll consistently get deep dives into exciting scientific advancements alongside Owen's classic interviews. So get ready to uncover the unexpected drama of scientific publishing coming up in our first official episode.
What does it actually take to get a wildly ambitious, totally paradigm-shifting scientific theory published?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right. Because when we think about scientific breakthroughs, for those of you listening, we often picture this incredibly clean eureka moment.
Yeah, the lone genius in a lab.
Exactly. A sudden realization, undeniable proof in the form of this crisp data set, and the entire scientific community just standing up and giving a slow clap.
If only it worked like that.
Right. But if you look behind the curtain, the reality is far more grueling. I mean, is it really about having crystal clear proof from the jump? Or is it about the sheer stubborn willingness to take your own life's work, let your harshest critics completely tear it down, and then rebuild the entire thing from the ground up?
It is absolutely the latter. I mean, we have this idealized vision of peer review as a sort of, academic spell check.
Like catching typos.
Yeah, a polite process where experts catch a typo or ask for a minor clarification. But in reality, when you're trying to introduce a concept that challenges the foundational architecture of a field, peer review is a crucible.
A total gauntlet.
It really is. It's a messy, deeply human negotiation over data, over language, philosophy, and occasionally very large egos. And it fundamentally shapes not just the paper itself, but how we conceptualize the natural world.
And that brings us to the mission of today's deep dive, because we are tracking the evolution of a single, highly controversial scientific paper.
And we have some incredible source material for this.
We really do. We have a massive stack of sources here: original preprint drafts, actual peer review comments, the author's private note, and some incredibly explosive behind-the-scenes email chains.
It's rare to get this level of access.
It is. We are looking at evolutionary biologist Owen Gilbert and his attempt to introduce a massive new concept called the theory of natural reward. He proposed this as a fundamental macroevolutionary force that, works right alongside Charles Darwin's natural selection.
Right, a co-pilot to Darwin, essentially. And to understand how an idea this big survives that crucible we talked about, we're using a very unique document as our roadmap.
The changes document.
Exactly. It's Gilbert's own changes file. It's a meticulous, almost philosophical log he wrote, outlining exactly how and why he transformed his initial 2019 preprint into the final version that was published in 2020.
And it was published in the journal Rethinking Ecology. And it is a wild, fascinating ride. We're going to explore how sweeping analogies about Silicon Valley tech giants were brutally purged.
Swapped out for hard biological data about sea squirts and mutant bacteria.
Yeah, and we'll look at the linguistic tightrope he had to walk, defending certain controversial phrases while abandoning historical philosophers just to keep his scientific credibility intact.
It just perfectly highlights that introducing a new paradigm isn't just about the data. It's about convincing a highly skeptical, entrenched community to learn an entirely new vocabulary.
So let's start right at the foundation of that changes document. Between the 2019 preprint and the 2020 publication, Gilbert essentially tore his own manuscript down to the studs.
He had to.
Right, because reviewer Miguel Proa essentially told him the original structure was opaque and lacked the very thing biology requires, which is biological evidence.
Minor detail.
Yeah, right? The teardown was so complete that even the title of the paper didn't survive.
No, it didn't. The initial 2019 preprint carried the title Natural Reward as the Fundamental Macroevolutionary Force.
Which is very heavy. It's static.
It really is. It reads like a textbook heading, declaring a fact, but it doesn't actually tell the reader what the force, does.
Right.
So in response to the reviewer's pushback on the clarity of his core thesis, Gilbert shifted it in 2020 to something much more dynamic. He changed it to natural reward drives the advancement of life.
Drives the advancement of life. Now, that immediately forces him into a corner, though.
Oh, entirely.
Because if you use a word like advancement in modern evolutionary biology, alarm bells must go off everywhere. It implies a direction or like a goal.
And that is the cardinal sin of modern Darwinian thinking.
No goals allowed.
Exactly. Evolution is not supposed to have a goal. So to justify that title, Gilbert had to rigorously slice his concepts into two distinct, highly specific definitions to satisfy his critics. He had to separate the idea of absolute progress from advancement.
So walk us through that split. For those listening, how do you define progress in a way that doesn't imply a species is becoming better or marching towards some perfect ideal?
Well, he defined absolute progress as a strict numbers game.
Just demographics.
Purely about population expansion. In Gilbert's framework, absolute progress occurs when a species taps into a new resource, say a new type of food or a previously uninhabited island, and its population numbers just explode as it exploits that resource.
No moral judgment attached.
None at all. It has nothing to do with moral superiority or even biological complexity. A highly simplified bacteria can experience absolute progress just as effectively as a complex mammal.
As long as its numbers are expanding into a new zone.
Exactly.
Okay, that strips the philosophical baggage out of progress. It's just demographic success. But then what is advancement?
Advancement is the long game. It's the second order effect of all those cycles of absolute progress.
Over deep time.
Over vast time frames, yeah. Billions of years. Species expand, they exploit resources, they eventually go extinct, and new species replace them. Advancement is the overarching long-term increase in the innovative capacity of life as a whole.
Like building a bigger toolkit.
Yes, it's the biosphere building a wider, more versatile toolkit over eons.
I see. So absolute progress is a single species hitting the jackpot and blowing up in numbers, while advancement is the entire tree of life slowly accumulating new capacities across geological time.
That's the distinction he had to make.
But when he tried to explain these grand mechanisms in the 2019 preprint, he didn't use paleontology or genetics.
No, he did not.
He used corporate business data, which seemed to completely infuriate the reviewers.
The economic purge is arguably the most dramatic shift in the entire document. To explain how natural selection and his new theory of natural reward interact, Gilbert originally relied heavily on Apple Inc.
I have to admit, reading the COM19 draft, the Apple analogy is wildly entertaining.
It is very catchy.
It makes this incredibly dense, abstract concept instantly relatable. I mean, he literally casts Charles Darwin's natural selection in the role of Steve Wozniak.
Which is funny to think about.
Right. Wozniak was the tinkerer. He was the engineer sitting in a garage playing around with circuit boards purely for the immediate benefit of solving a localized technical problem.
He wasn't building an empire.
No, he wasn't thinking about a global computer market at all. He was just building a cool machine for the homebrew computer club.
And in this analogy, Gilbert's new force, natural reward, is Steve Jobs.
The entrepreneur.
Jobs doesn't necessarily invent the core circuitry, but he possesses the entrepreneurial vision. He recognizes an emerging market.
Yeah.
He takes Wozniak's invention, packages it in a user-friendly way, and disseminates it globally to exploit a vast, untapped economic resource. He captures the market.
And it wasn't just Apple. He used the fast food industry, too.
Oh, the McDonald's analogy.
Yes. Natural selection is the McDonald brothers inventing the highly efficient, speedy service system to make burgers faster in one specific restaurant in California.
Local problem, local solution.
Exactly. But natural reward is Ray Kroc, the entrepreneur who comes along, recognizes the massive potential of that system, franchises it, and uses it to achieve global fast food domination.
It's a brilliant way to explain the difference between the origin of an invention and the ultimate success of that invention.
Conceptual brilliance aside, though, the peer reviewers utterly rejected it.
They absolutely hated it. Reviewer 4515 and Miguel Proa stated explicitly that the theory felt taken out of the discipline of economics.
Which is a harsh critique for a biology paper.
The core complaint was that corporate market behavior appeared to be Gilbert's primary source of empirical data. I mean, he even included a massive table in the 2019 draft quoting historic economists.
Like centuries-old economists.
Yeah, people like Jean-Baptiste Say, Richard Cantillon, and Joseph Schumpeter. He used them to define terms like monopoly profit.
But if I'm a rigorous biologist reading this, I'm throwing a flag on the play. It's like trying to explain the mechanics of a supernova by comparing it to a corporate merger.
It doesn't track.
It paints a nice picture in a boardroom, sure, but the physical universe doesn't care about quarterly profit margins or franchising rights.
And the biological objection runs much deeper than just a preference for organic examples. It is a profound philosophical objection regarding teleology.
Goal-oriented thinking.
Yes. When you use human economic metaphors, especially figures like Steve Jobs or Ray Kroc, you are inherently smuggling the concept of conscious foresight into the equation.
Because humans plan things.
Exactly. Human entrepreneurs write business plans. They analyze market trends and deliberately design strategies to achieve a future outcome. But a foundational, non-negotiable rule of modern evolutionary biology is that nature has zero foresight.
It's blind.
Completely blind. Evolution cannot plan for the future. It cannot design a wing today because it knows the animal will need to fly 1,000,000 years from now.
Right?
So by leaning on these corporate titans, Gilbert inadvertently made natural reward sound like a conscious guiding hand.
A teleological trap. So he had to execute a total purge. The changes document shows him deleting Steve Jobs, deleting Ray Kroc, and scrubbing the quotes from the classical economists.
A complete sweep.
But he didn't surrender completely, did he? He kept the economic vocabulary.
He was incredibly stubborn about the terminology.
Yeah.
He removed the 20th century business case studies, but he fiercely defended keeping phrases like monopoly profit, incumbent advantage, and the concept of entrepreneurship in nature.
How does he justify keeping the corporate jargon if he's actively trying to convince biologists that his theory isn't just an economic metaphor?
Well, he argued to the reviewers that these specific terms, when you strip away the human intent, they perfectly capture the mathematical and ecological mechanics of biological resource domination.
Like reaching a tipping point.
Yeah. In nature, when a species is the first to evolve a way to exploit a new resource, they gain a literal first mover advantage. They monopolize that ecological niche. As a result, their population expands exponentially.
And that demographic explosion is the monopoly profit.
Exactly. That massive demographic expansion is the monopoly profit. He insisted that natural reward is a purely biological framework, and these economic terms were simply the most precise vocabulary available.
To describe the winner-takes-all race.
Yes, the indirect competition of a race to dominate an environment.
It's a bold move, though, to tell a room full of biologists they need to start talking like Wall Street traders.
Very bold.
But to get them to accept that vocabulary, he had to provide the one thing they demanded, right? Hard physical evidence from the natural world.
The raw data.
If you can't use a Silicon Valley CEO to explain the entrepreneur, what biological organism actually acts like a corporate monopoly?
This is where the 2020 paper transforms into a truly rigorous piece of science. Gilbert swapped out Silicon Valley for the deep ocean and the ancient earth. He leaned into intensely complex biological case studies.
He had to bring the receipts.
He brought the receipts. He started with his own area of deep empirical expertise. Ascidians, more commonly known as sea squirts.
Sea squirts. These are marine invertebrates, often found clinging to rocks or boat hulls.
Yeah, they essentially look like little rubbery tubes.
So how does a sea squirt prove a grand macroevolutionary theory?
The proof lies in a highly complex biological mechanism they possess called histocompatibility.
Histocompatibility. That's a mouthful.
It is. Basically, this is the genetic ability of an organism to distinguish its own tissues from foreign tissues, to recognize self from non-self.
Like how human immune systems reject organ transplants.
Very similar. And in sea squirts, this is literally a matter of life and death because they grow in incredibly dense, crowded colonies. As they grow, their bodies constantly bump into each other, and they frequently attempt to physically fuse their circulatory systems together.
Whoa. So if you are going to literally merge your bloodstream with the creature next to you, you desperately need to know if that creature is your genetic twin or a complete stranger.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Gilbert uses the sea squirt to demonstrate the absolute separation between natural selection, the blind tinkerer, and natural reward, the entrepreneur.
How so?
He breaks down the evolution of this histocompatibility trait into a meticulous 5-step selective sequence. In the early evolutionary steps, natural selection is merely trying to solve an immediate localized crisis. In this case, the deadly cost of fusing with a non-relative. When a sea squirt fuses with a genetically distinct neighbor, it results in massive cellular conflict and often death. Over time, this builds a hypervariable genetic recognition system.
It's just a local defense mechanism.
Exactly. It's a brilliant invention, but it was forged purely to stop local cellular conflict. However, once this intricate self versus non-self system is fully constructed, it happens to possess an astonishing, entirely unintended side effect.
And this is where the entrepreneur steps in, the natural reward.
Yes. This incredibly strict genetic screening process incidentally makes the sea squirt colonies highly resistant to social parasites.
Social parasite.
In colonial organisms, a social parasite is a rogue cell lineage that sneaks into the colony, contributes nothing to the communal structure, and just selfishly drains resources to replicate itself.
Like a freeloader.
A very dangerous freeloader. But because the sea squirts have this newly evolved hyper-strict recognition system, the rogue cells are immediately identified as non-self and rejected.
So because the colony is immune to being destroyed from within by parasites, they can expand.
They can expand massively.
Mm-hmm.
These cooperative species can exploit vast, untapped resource zones. They can grow into massive, sprawling, highly integrated colonies covering entire reef systems.
So the invention was just a localized defense mechanism.
Yes, against neighboring cell conflict.
But the reward was unlocking immense ecological dominance and absolute progress. The tinkerer didn't know the reward was coming, and the reward process didn't design the invention.
That perfectly isolates the two forces.
But evolutionary biology requires historical proof. If evolution is just stumbling in the dark and piecing this together step by step, how does Gilbert prove this recognition system wasn't secretly building toward that grand goal the whole time?
He proved it by providing a phylogenetic map.
Like a family tree.
Exactly. In Figure 7 of the 2020 paper, he included a brand new cladogram mapping the evolutionary relationships across 3 different suborders of sea squirts.
Which suborders?
Phlebobranchia, Aplosobranchia, and Stolidobranchia.
Okay, those are some real biology terms right there.
They are. But the point of this chart is that it demonstrates that the transitional, clunky, intermediate steps of this recognition system still exist independently in various living species today.
So you can literally look across the ocean today and see species stuck on rung 2 of the ladder, surviving just fine, completely unaware of utopia, waiting on rung 5.
It proves that the complex trait evolved through a contingent, piecemeal historical process. Each intermediate step offered an immediate local survival benefit. It shatters the illusion of grand design and grounds his theory in observable empirical genetic history.
That handles the marine invertebrates. But to truly establish this as a universal macroevolutionary force, he needs examples across entirely different kingdoms of life. What did he use to replace the McDonald's franchising analogy?
He turned to botany, specifically the evolution of C4 photosynthesis in plants.
Now, photosynthesis seems pretty straightforward. Plants take in sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they make food. Most plants use standard photosynthesis, which is called C3. What makes C4 different?
C4 is an incredibly specialized, highly efficient metabolic pathway. It operates brilliantly in hot, arid environments where carbon dioxide is scarce. The standard C3 process relies on an enzyme called rubisco to grab carbon dioxide from the air.
Okay, rubisco.
But rubisco has a fatal flaw. It is notoriously sloppy. In hot conditions, it frequently grabs oxygen by mistake instead of carbon dioxide, leading to a wasteful, toxic process called photorespiration that drains the plant's energy.
So C4 is the upgraded machinery that fixes that sloppy flaw.
It is a massive upgrade. C4 plants physically separate the carbon-grabbing process from the rest of photosynthesis. They use specialized bundle sheath cells to concentrate CO2, ensuring rubisco never makes that mistake.
Sounds perfect.
But here is the critical point for Gilbert's theory. A plant lineage cannot just magically jump from standard C3 to supercharged C4. It has to evolve through at least 4 distinct, highly complex metabolic and anatomical steps.
It's a multi-part invention.
It is only after all 4 of these steps accumulate over millions of years, the salvage pathways, the specialized anatomy, the biochemical pumps, that the plant possesses the fully functional, hyper-efficient C4 pathway.
And then the environment shifts. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels drop globally, and suddenly the plant hits the jackpot.
The low CO2 atmosphere became the vast, untapped reward for the fully evolved C4 pathway. The plants possessing C4 were suddenly able to rapidly expand and absolutely dominate new, hot, dry ecological niches globally.
Unbelievable.
Again, it definitively separates the cause of the invention's origin salvaging lost carbon from the cause of its ultimate success dominating low CO2 environments.
It is like someone inventing a weird, weak adhesive. They throw it in a drawer to solve some minor issue, and a million years later, the environment changes, the office supplies market emerges, and someone realizes this weak glue makes the perfect Post-it note.
That is a very good way to put it.
The tinkerer and the entrepreneur. It works perfectly. Did he apply this to animals too?
He did, by tackling the most dramatic narrative in paleontology, mammalian radiation and the concept of extinction replacement mega-evolution.
Extinction replacement, that sounds like a hostile corporate takeover.
Which brings us back to his fierce defense of those economic terms. For tens of millions of years during the Mesozoic era, dinosaurs held an absolute, unbreakable, incumbent advantage. They monopolized almost all of the large-scale terrestrial resource zones on the planet.
A total biological monopoly. They owned the market.
Now, during this entire epoch, early mammals were scurrying around in the underbrush, nocturnal and small. But natural selection was busy doing its localized tinkering.
Because they had to survive in the shadows.
Driven by the pressures of surviving in the shadows of giants, mammals evolved a staggering array of biological innovations. They developed endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, to survive the cold nights.
Which is huge.
They evolved placenta for internal gestation to protect their vulnerable young. They developed mame to feed those young without foraging, and they evolved vastly improved neurological capacity to process complex sensory information in the dark.
So the mammals spent millions of years building this incredible, versatile toolkit. They possessed massive innovative capacity, but they couldn't use it to take over the world.
Because the dinosaurs held the monopoly. The mammals were entirely locked out of the macro market. They couldn't expand into large daytime herbivores or massive apex predators because those niches were fiercely defended.
The bouncers were at the door.
But then, 66 million years ago, the Chicxulub asteroid strikes the Earth. The dinosaurs are wiped out. The incumbent advantage is shattered in a geological blink of an eye.
The market is abruptly cleared.
And this is the moment of natural reward. Suddenly, those mammalian innovations, which had originated for completely different localized reasons in the nocturnal underbrush, are subjected to the reward of a vacant planet.
And they just explode.
Mammals radiate explosively. They expand into niches that dinosaurs never even conceptualized. They adapt to cold water marine environments, becoming whales. They take to the skies as bats.
And eventually hominids emerge, utilizing that deep neurological capacity to exploit entirely new, non-biological energy sources like fossil fuels and nuclear power.
The innovations originated under the brutal pressure of selection, but the massive overarching advancement of the mammalian class was driven by the reward of a cleared resource zone. It is pure entrepreneurial exploitation on a planetary scale.
He also touches briefly on the absolute fundamentals of life, right? Like sexual reproduction and the genetic code itself.
Yes. To demonstrate that natural reward isn't just about animals or plants, it governs the fundamental architecture of biology. Take sexual reproduction. Evolutionary biologists have debated the cost of sex for decades.
Because asexual reproduction is faster.
Right. Asexual reproduction is mathematically much faster and more efficient for passing on genes. Natural selection might explain how sex is maintained in a specific population, perhaps by generating enough genetic variation to outpace local parasites. But Gilbert argues that natural reward explains why sex is so universally, overwhelmingly dominant across the entire planet.
What is the grand reward of sexual reproduction?
Sex facilitates massive genomic novelty. It allows for hybridization, introgression, and the lateral sharing of successful genetic inventions across populations. Asexual lineages might win a short-term race, but sexual lineages possess the innovative capacity to invade completely new habitats, adapt to radical changes, and radiate far more effectively.
So the global ubiquity of sexual reproduction is the ultimate macroevolutionary reward for its capacity to generate and share novelty.
Exactly. It's the engine for advancement.
It is the ultimate dissemination engine and the genetic code itself. The fact that almost every living thing on Earth uses the exact same base pairs to build proteins.
Gilbert frames the near universal genetic code as the ultimate first mover advantage. In the primordial soup, early life forms that happened to standardize around the most abundant and chemically useful code gained access to a vastly larger pool of interchangeable protein innovations.
It makes me think of the global dominance of the English language in international science or aviation.
That is a very apt parallel. Gilbert actually points out that English is not necessarily the most efficient language. It has a notoriously clunky relationship between its vocabulary and numerical concepts compared to some Asian languages.
Yeah, spelling rules are a mess.
But the intrinsic efficiency doesn't matter once it achieves critical mass. Once a language or a genetic code becomes the universal standard, it provides a monumental advantage for sharing innovations across radically different groups.
This is a networking effect.
The universal genetic code is an advancement because it essentially networks the entire biosphere, allowing the fruits of the blind inventor to be shared globally.
Wow. We have journeyed from the corporate boardroom to sea squirts, C4 plants, the asteroid impact, and the building blocks of DNA. It is a stunning upgrade in empirical evidence. But reading through this changes document, it wasn't just the data that needed an overhaul. It was the fundamental way he visually and conceptually organized the logic of his theory.
Reviewers didn't just want facts, they wanted a coherent structure.
Which brings us to the structural teardown. The way you present a new paradigm is just as critical as the data supporting it. In the 2019 preprint, Gilbert attempted to contrast his theory with Darwin's using a very specific visual metaphor. He used two side-by-side houses.
The architectural metaphor.
How did the Darwin house operate?
Well, Gilbert drew the Darwinian house to represent the foundational logic of the origin of species. The foundation of Darwin's house was labeled resource limitation.
Right, the whole Malthusian idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is the Malthusian concept that there is never enough food, space, or energy to support the number of offspring produced. Because the foundation is limitation, the walls of the house represent the resulting force, the struggle for existence. Organisms must fiercely compete for those scarce resources to survive.
The classic survival of the fittest. And the roof.
The roof of the Darwinian house is the evolutionary outcome. The origin of complex adaptive traits through slight successive modifications.
Okay, a very solid traditional foundation. What did his newly proposed natural reward house look like?
Gilbert built a parallel house to show that his theory didn't destroy Darwin's. It just operated on a different premise. The foundation of the natural reward house was the exact opposite, resource abundance.
Abundance.
Gilbert argued that if you look at the universe, there is a massive overflow of free energy, specifically radiating from the sun, and life on Earth has not even come close to fully exploiting all available matter and energy.
But if the foundation is abundance, what drives the walls? You can't have a struggle for existence if there is plenty of food.
Exactly. The walls of Gilbert's house represented a different force, the struggle for supremacy. It is a macro-level race to innovate and conquer those vast, untapped biological markets. The central operating force is natural reward, and the roof of this house was the outcome. Progress and advancement defined by massive population expansion into new niches.
Conceptually, breaking it down into two different logical pathways makes sense. Why did he have to completely delete the houses in the 2020 paper?
Because the peer reviewers found the actual visual execution intensely confusing.
Oh, the graphics were bad.
One reviewer pointed out that visually, the two houses looked absolutely identical. They were literally the exact same line drawing of a generic house, just with different text labels slapped onto the foundation, walls, and roof.
So it didn't actually help.
The reviewers felt it was a clunky, redundant visual that actually obscured the underlying science rather than illuminating it.
If the visual doesn't map to a biologist's traditional understanding of causal mechanisms, it's just distracting clip art. What did he replace it with to appease them?
He scrapped the architectural metaphor entirely and replaced it with a sleek, abstract flowchart in Figure 3. The flowchart abandons metaphor and simply maps the biological causal sequence. Natural selection originates in invention. Natural reward governs the dissemination of that innovation, which inevitably results in absolute progress, population expansion.
Much cleaner and strictly scientific.
Much better.
And he also executed a massive overhaul of his tables, right? Table 1 in the original 2019 draft was basically just a glossary of vocabulary terms. But in the 2020 version, he introduces this incredibly intense, complex hierarchy of genetic systems. Why the drastic shift in focus?
Again, it comes back to the reviewers demanding physical mechanisms.
Yeah.
You cannot walk into a room of evolutionary biologists and simply wave your hands and say, a force rewards things.
They want to see the math.
They demanded to know what specific physical unit of matter is this force acting upon. Darwinian selection acts on alleles. What does natural reward act on?
He had to show them the engine block.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So Gilbert constructed Table 2 to classify the hierarchical genetic systems that natural reward manipulates. He mapped it from the very bottom, the standard genetic code shared by almost all life up through basic chromosome structures into core regulatory gene complexes that he calls kernels.
Kernels.
Yeah, which define the basic body plan of entire phyla, and then all the way up to the individual protein coding genes that determine the shape of a specific fin or beak.
So he is arguing that natural reward isn't just a broad, vague phenomenon. It can act on the fundamental language of DNA itself, or it can scale up to act on the specific gene complex that gives a beetle its horn.
Yes. And by structuring it this way, Gilbert was attempting something breathtakingly ambitious. He was using his new theory to try and dissolve one of the most bitter, long-standing arguments in the history of evolutionary biology, the units of selection controversy.
Oh, this is a massive debate. It brings to mind Richard Dawkins and the whole selfish gene concept versus folks like Stephen Jay Gould, who argued evolution acts on higher levels. The debate is essentially, when nature selects something, is it selecting the individual gene, the whole organism, a group of organisms, or an entire species?
That is the exact battleground. The neo-Darwinian paradigm essentially tried to smash all of these complex interactions into a single localized metric called differential reproductive fitness. Gilbert argued that this was a sterile controversy, a debate that has spun its wheels for decades because the fundamental premise of the question is flawed.
How does the introduction of natural reward solve a debate that Dawkins and Gould couldn't settle?
By splitting the physics of evolution into three distinct manageable levels. First, Gilbert defines the unit of force. This is the gene or the gene complex. It is the actual physical code that the invisible forces of nature push and pull upon.
Okay, level 1.
Second, he defines the unit of reproduction. That is the whole organism, the individual bird or bacteria or human. The organism is merely the physical vehicle through which these forces manifest their ultimate effects by reproducing.
The code is the object of the force, and the body is just the vehicle carrying the code. What is the third level?
The third level is the unit of competition, and this is the stroke of brilliance. Gilbert argues that the unit of competition actually changes depending on which of the two macro forces you are observing.
It depends on which house you're standing in.
Exactly. If you were looking at Darwin's struggle for existence, everyday natural selection, the unit of competition is the allele within a single localized species. It is one version of a moth wing colored gene competing against a different version of that exact same gene to avoid being eaten by a bird.
Okay, that's the micro level.
But if you zoom out and look at Gilbert's struggle for supremacy natural reward, the unit of competition scales up massively. It becomes the entire gene complex shared by higher taxonomic groups. It isn't moth versus moth. It is mammals competing against dinosaurs, angiosperms competing against gymnosperms.
By formally separating the roles, tinkering at the tiny allelic level for origin, and disseminating at the massive gene complex level for success, he basically gives everyone in the historical debate a place to stand. Dawkins gets his selfish genes for selection, and Gould gets his higher level macro patterns for reward.
It provides a pristine hierarchical structure. But there was one final structural and linguistic hurdle he had to clear, and it loops us right back to our discussion about Steve Jobs and the dreaded teleology trap.
The problem of foresight. The implication that evolution is drafting a business plan.
Yes. Reviewer Yoel Stewart zeroed in on this exact issue in the 2019 preprint. Stewart pointed out that by continually using the word entrepreneur and talking about envisioning emerging markets, Gilbert was implicitly telling the reader that nature has a future goal in mind. It made the theory sound mystical rather than mechanical.
So how do you keep the concept of an entrepreneur exploiting a market without implying the entrepreneur has a brain?
Gilbert made a highly calculated linguistic concession. In the 2020 paper, he explicitly bolted a very specific modifier onto his core terms. He formally labeled natural selection the blind inventor, and he explicitly labeled natural reward the the blind entrepreneur.
Blind, adding that one word does an incredible amount of philosophical heavy lifting.
It entirely neutralizes the threat of teleology. Gilbert argued that while human entrepreneurs use conscious strategies and foresight, biological emerging markets are so chaotic, so vastly complex, that nature's entrepreneur operates completely blind. Innovations hit the jackpot and succeed for completely unanticipated circumstantial reasons.
It makes me think of how internet culture works.
How so?
Well, nobody sits in a lab and meticulously engineers the perfect viral meme with a guaranteed outcome. People just throw thousands of random weird jokes onto the internet every day. That is, the blind inventor just tinkering. Most of them fail. But suddenly, the cultural environment shifts, the algorithm hits a weird tipping point, and it blindly rewards one specific joke, blowing it up globally to millions of people.
That's a great example.
That is the blind entrepreneur. The algorithm didn't plan the joke, and the teenager who posted the joke didn't plan the global cultural moment. It's just a collision of invention and environment.
That is a phenomenal parallel. By anchoring his theory with the word blind, Gilbert successfully defended his framework as strictly deterministic. He maintained that macroevolution is governed by law-like antecedent forces, meaning observable causes come before physical effects, without requiring any miraculous final causes, divine intervention, or grand design.
So, if we look at the scorecard so far, he compromised on the word blind. He tore down the architectural houses. He deleted Steve Jobs. He provided rigorous biological case studies. He was clearly willing to play ball with the peer reviewers to get this paradigm-shifting idea onto the record.
He was making the necessary trades.
But if we look at the correspondence, there was one deeply contentious phrase he absolutely refused to surrender, regardless of the pushback.
The linguistic battleground. This is where we see Gilbert draw a very hard line in the sand over the specific phrase, struggle for supremacy.
Struggle for supremacy. I can immediately see why that phrase would raise the hackles of an academic review board who specifically objected to it.
Reviewer Joel Lehman. And what's interesting is that Lehman was actually one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the paper. He thought the underlying theory was brilliant. But he found the phrase struggle for supremacy to be, in his own words, over the top and carrying dangerous political and dominative connotations.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate. If I'm a rigorous scientist reading this, struggle for supremacy sounds significantly less like a biological mechanism and a lot more like a supervillain manifesto. Doesn't utilizing that kind of highly charged, aggressive language risk alienating the exact data-driven community Gilbert is desperately trying to persuade?
It is a massive risk.
Oh.
Words carry historical weight, and science does not exist in a vacuum. Lehman actually offered Gilbert a much softer, more palatable alternative. He suggested Gilbert swap the phrase for the struggle for creative expansion.
Creative expansion? That sounds much nicer. It sounds like a community art project or a tech startup's mission statement. Why didn't Gilbert just take the easy out to keep the peace?
Because Gilbert argued that creative expansion is scientifically inadequate for describing the brutal reality of what actually happens in nature. Biological conquests are rarely polite, and they're not always creative.
Unpack that. What does an uncreative expansion look like?
Sometimes a biological lineage expands, not because it invented something wonderfully novel and complex, but simply because it engaged in purely opportunistic exploitation of an empty space.
It's like finding a loophole.
Exactly. Imagine an island ecosystem completely sterilized by a volcanic eruption. The first species of seagull to land on that cooled lava and take over the ecosystem isn't being creative. It didn't evolve a new trade. It is just ruthlessly exploiting a vacancy before anyone else can get there.
It is just acting like a ruthless biological monopoly.
Exactly. Gilbert stated that the word expansion alone entirely fails to capture the absolute monopolistic domination of resources that occurs when a lineage conquers a macro niche. He needed vocabulary that conveyed the raw power of the monopoly profit and the incumbent advantage. When mammals took over the earth after the dinosaurs died, they didn't just creatively expand. They achieved total supremacy over the terrestrial resource zones, actively and aggressively locking all other potential competitors out for millions of years.
He is drawing a very sharp, deliberate distinction against Darwin's original language here.
He is. Darwin's phrase, struggle for existence, is fundamentally a microevolutionary concept. It is about individuals fighting for mere survival within a single localized population. It is the gazelle running slightly faster than the other gazelle to avoid the cheetah.
Right.
But Gilbert's struggle for supremacy is unapologetically macroevolutionary. It is about entirely different, massive higher taxa fighting to completely dominate entire global ecosystems.
Did he have any academic precedent for demanding such harsh, aggressive language in a modern journal?
He did. And he wielded it effectively in his rebuttal to the reviewers. He pointed first to historical and geopolitical scholarship, citing academic books with titles like The Struggle for Supremacy in the Pacific. He argued that in history, the term specifically denotes a dominant power monopolizing a region and its resources, which maps perfectly to biological reality.
But geopolitics isn't biology. Did any actual biologists use the term?
Yes. He noted that Charles Darwin himself used the phrase in his writings. Furthermore, he cited highly respected modern authors, such as Palmer and Barrett, in their textbook Evolution. The Story of Life, who used the exact phrase struggle for supremacy, specifically to describe the massive radiation and dominance of mammals.
So he stood his ground and kept struggle for supremacy, but he did make one massive concession regarding the philosophical baggage of that theory, didn't he? Because in the original 2019 version, he didn't just cite biologists. He cited a highly controversial philosopher to justify this struggle for power.
He did. In 2019, to establish a metaphysical basis for the idea that life's fundamental driving nature is to expand whenever resources are abundant, Gilbert heavily cited the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
That is quite the leap from sea squirts.
He explicitly cited Nietzsche's works, specifically The Gay Science and the Antichrist, to define a biological struggle for economic power or dominance. He leaned on Nietzsche's perspective that the basic point of life is to expand, to validate his theory that life is fundamentally an entrepreneurial pursuit of supremacy.
Now, I have to imagine that dropping quotes from the Antichrist into a peer-reviewed biology paper about macroevolution triggered an absolute meltdown among the reviewers.
Oh, it was immediately flagged. The scientific community relies on empirical data, not 19th century philosophy. Reviewer Miguel Proa specifically zeroed in on this, pointing out with concern that Gilbert's core postulate was referenced back to Nietzsche, lumping it in with the overarching complaints about relying on non-biological frameworks.
So how did Gilbert navigate that? Did he try to defend Nietzsche's biological relevance?
No. He recognized that it was a bridge too far. In the transition to the 2020 paper, Gilbert scrubbed every single mention of Nietzsche from the text.
Just totally deleted?
Yep. To soften the tone and keep the focus strictly on the observable science, the philosopher was completely erased. He ultimately justified his struggle for supremacy by relying purely on the biological precedent we just discussed, rather than philosophical treatises on the will to power.
It is a fascinating high-wire act of academic negotiation. He concedes on the philosopher, he drops the Silicon Valley CEOs, he accepts the modifier blind, but he absolutely refuses to soften the core description of the biological mechanism itself.
It perfectly demonstrates how scientists must constantly balance the need for precise, impactful terminology against the very real risk of triggering ideological or philosophical alarm bells that could sink the paper entirely.
Which brings us to the climax of this story. Because this uncompromising attitude toward his own theoretical vision eventually led Gilbert into a direct, fiery collision with one of the foremost experts in evolutionary biology. We are moving past the anonymous peer reviewers and into intense interpersonal scientific drama. Let's look at the collaboration with Zach Blount.
This is where things get really intense.
Set the stage for us. What is Figure 5 and why did Zach Blount become involved in this process?
Well, as we discussed, Gilbert needed bulletproof biological evidence, and there is perhaps no greater repository of raw data in modern evolutionary biology than the long-term evolution experiment, or the LTE. This is a legendary ongoing experiment initiated by Richard Linsky back in 1988. They've been tracking the day-by-day evolution of E. coli bacteria in flasks for tens of thousands of generations. It allows scientists to literally watch evolution happen in real time.
And the absolute crown jewel of the LTE was the spontaneous evolution of a trait called citrate metabolism, or CIT plus site.
Exactly. After roughly 31,500 generations of just surviving on a limited glucose diet, one specific lineage of E. coli suddenly evolved the miraculous ability to consume citrate, a secondary carbon source that was floating in their broth, but which they had previously been entirely unable to digest.
It was a massive biological innovation. They basically evolved the ability to eat the air they were breathing.
It was a textbook example of absolute progress and natural reward. To ensure that he mapped the deeply complex multi-step sequence of this specific evolution flawlessly for his paper, Gilbert decided to feature it as Figure 5. And to make sure it was perfect, he reached out directly via email to Zach Blount.
And Blount is a big deal.
Blount is a prominent evolutionary biologist and a leading internationally recognized expert who did the groundbreaking foundational work on the LTE citrate project.
So Gilbert essentially emails the leading authority and says, "Can you check my homework on this graphic before I publish it?"
Exactly. He emailed Blount his draft of Figure 5, which outlined a 7-step evolutionary sequence leading to the CIP plus breakthrough. And Blount, showing incredible collegiality, engaged deeply with the request. He provided phenomenally nuanced, highly technical scientific corrections to Gilbert's draft.
What kind of corrections are we talking about? Let's get into the microbiological weeds here.
They were intensely specific regarding the cellular machinery. For instance, in steps 1 and 2 of the draft, Gilbert had initially described the bacteria engaging in sloppy feeding on glucose, which leaked a byproduct called acetate into the broth.
Okay, sloppy feeding.
Blount corrected this mechanism entirely. He explained it wasn't a sloppy leakage, it was rapid glucose feeding. The bacteria were growing so aggressively on the glucose that they saturated their internal metabolic cycles and actively, deliberately pumped out the acetate byproduct to prevent unbalanced cellular growth.
Okay, so correcting the fundamental mechanism of how the byproduct was created, what else did he catch?
In steps 3 through 5, Blount helped Gilbert refine the exact, specific genetic mutations that optimized the bacteria's ability to consume that acetate they were pumping out. They tracked specific mutations in genes like ICLR, which inactivated a certain metabolic shunt, and ARCB, which re-repressed a specific cycle.
Real hardcore molecular biology. They are mapping the blueprints of the blind tinkerer.
And crucially, in step 5, Blount clarified the massive genetic tipping point, the CT-tandem duplication. Gilbert had written in his draft that this specific mutation increased citrate transport into the cell. Blount corrected him, emphasizing that this mutation allows the transport of citrate into the cell under aerobic conditions.
It allows it, doesn't just increase it.
Before that specific duplication event, 0 citrate was flowing in. It didn't just increase an existing flow, it unlocked the door.
It sounds incredibly collaborative. They are literally emailing back and forth, polishing the exact same data points, refining these 7 steps of E. coli evolution to molecular perfection. If they were working so closely and harmoniously on the exact same data set, where did the catastrophic disconnect happen?
The disconnect happened on the final step, step 7. And the crucial thing to understand is that it wasn't a disagreement about the data itself. It was a profound, irreconcilable philosophical fracture over how to interpret the mechanics of that data.
Explain that fracture line. How do you look at the same data and see 2 different realities?
In Gilbert's proposed Figure 5, steps 1 through 6 represent natural selection, acting strictly as the blind inventor. The bacteria are accumulating these complex mutations, the acetate pumping, the ICLR mutation, the CT duplication, purely for immediate local survival benefits in their environment. The bacteria have absolutely no idea that a massive reserve of citrate is sitting there waiting to be eaten.
They're just Wozniak tinkering in the garage to keep the lights on.
Precisely. But step 7, in Gilbert's view, represents an entirely different phenomenon. Natural reward. The bacteria finally hit the genetic threshold, the complex invention is complete, and suddenly, blindly, they are able to exploit this massive, untapped citrate resource zone. The population explodes in a massive demographic surge. Gilbert argued that step 7 requires the introduction of a completely separate macro force.
And how did Zach Blount view step 7?
Blount viewed the entire 7-step sequence, including the final population explosion, as simply natural selection, doing what natural selection has always done. To Blount, natural selection favors fitness at every single mutation. Step 1, improve fitness. Step 5, improve fitness. And step 7, massively improve fitness. There is absolutely no need to invent a brand new paradigm-shifting force just because the final mutation happened to unlock a remarkably large resource.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the subtlety of this split. Blount is saying selection favored step 1, selection favored step 2, and selection favored step 7. It is a single, unbroken chain of natural selection.
Yes, the traditional neo-Darwinian view.
But Gilbert is saying, no, selection favored 1 through 6 for local minor reasons, but step 7 is a completely different phenomenon entirely.
Exactly. And in their correspondence, Gilbert actually tried to use Blount's own previous publications against him. Gilbert pointed out a sentence Blount himself had written in a previous article about the LTE, where Blount wrote, "The big reward came only at the end."
Oh, wow.
Gilbert was essentially emailing him to say, look, you are instinctively using my exact language. You recognize that the final massive payoff is functionally disconnected from the early incremental tinkering.
Oh, trying to use a scientist's own colloquial phrasing to prove they secretly agree with your new paradigm is a dangerous game? How did Blount react to that?
The reaction was severe. This is where the story shifts from a polite academic disagreement over wording into accusations of crackpottery and profound professional insult. What started as a collaboration over a molecular biology chart rapidly devolved.
I need to hear these emails. What actually happened?
On September 11, 2020, Blount sent a final, highly charged, extensive email to Gilbert. He flat out rejected the entire natural reward theoretical framework, stating unequivocally that the terminology was unnecessary and added absolutely nothing of value to the existing understanding of evolutionary mechanics. But he went much, much further than just critiquing the biological interpretation.
He escalated it to a professional critique.
He did. Blount revealed in the email that he had actually asked a couple of his trusted colleagues to look at Gilbert's draft paper, and both of those colleagues had advised Blount to simply ignore Gilbert entirely, labeling him a crackpot.
Wow. Crackpot is the absolute nuclear option in the scientific community. To be labeled a crackpot by leading experts means you are not just wrong, it means you are considered entirely outside the bounds of serious, rigorous scholarship. It means you aren't worth debating.
It's a devastating label. Blount noted that he was choosing to ignore that specific advice because he genuinely felt Gilbert meant well and was trying to do serious work, but the damage of revealing that label was done. Furthermore, Blount heavily criticized Gilbert's overarching methodology and his tone. He noted with deep concern that Gilbert was actively planning to write a book for a general audience about his theory of natural reward.
Taking the scientific debate directly to the public instead of keeping it in the journals.
Yes, and Blount compared this approach directly to the tactics used by intelligent design creationists. He accused Gilbert of dismissing the valid critiques of established experts and trying to go straight to a book to influence the public and impressionable young scientists, stating it was not a road anyone who is serious should want to walk.
That is a staggering accusation. Comparing an evolutionary biologist to an intelligent design creationist simply because he wants to write a book outlining his theory, that is a deeply offensive parallel. What else was Blount angry about?
The language Gilbert used to describe his own peers. Blount was deeply offended by how Gilbert characterized the current state of evolutionary theory in the manuscript. In the text, Gilbert had used the word schizophrenic to describe the glaring contradictions in modern evolutionary theory, and he essentially suggested that some mainstream biologists were delusional in how they viewed macroevolution. Blount firmly told him that referring to his colleagues in the entire field with that kind of language was really not okay.
I can completely understand why a working biologist who has dedicated his life to this field would take intense umbrage at being called delusional by a researcher who is trying to rewrite the foundational rules of their discipline. But there is one more major piece to this email confrontation, right? The comparison to Darwin himself.
Yes. Blount took significant pointed offense to the fact that Gilbert frequently compared the magnitude and importance of his natural reward theory to Charles Darwin's original discovery of natural selection. Blount laid into him regarding this comparison. He pointed out that Darwin spent more than 20 years painstakingly amassing evidence, quietly establishing his scientific credentials, and crucially, taking the views of his critics very seriously before publishing. Blount called Gilbert precipitous and urged him to adopt Darwin's humble, cautious approach.
We tend to picture the scientific process as purely objective, just data-gathering robots calmly evaluating facts. But this correspondence reads like a furious rock band breaking up over creative differences. Gilbert is essentially saying, I'm playing a completely new genre of music, and Blount is looking at the sheet music and saying, no, you're just playing out of tune and you're insulting the orchestra. How on earth did Gilbert respond to a barrage like that? Did he back down?
Gilbert absolutely did not back down. He said a fierce, highly articulate, multi-point defense of his work, his methodology, and his historical framing. First, he directly addressed the charge that he hadn't put in the grueling effort that Darwin had. Gilbert pointed out that just as Darwin synthesized a massive body of existing research from geologists and breeders, he himself had synthesized over a century of post-Darwinian research across physics, economics, and molecular biology, in addition to his own years of empirical study.
So he's saying, I did do the work, I just drew a conclusion that threatens your worldview.
Exactly. And regarding the explosive accusation that he was acting like a creationist by ignoring critics and going straight to a book, Gilbert pointed out the profound historical irony of that statement. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was a book written for a general audience. Darwin didn't publish his grand theory in a peer-reviewed journal first. He synthesized it and went straight to the public via a commercial book.
That is an incredible, undeniable historical counterpunch.
It is brilliantly argued. Gilbert thoroughly challenged the mythological humble Darwin narrative. He noted that Darwin's Victorian critics didn't find him humble at all. They found him brash, arrogant, and operating without proofs. Gilbert argued that The Origin of Species was essentially a theoretical and rhetorical masterpiece that, at the exact time of its publication, actually lacked concrete, observable examples of new species originating by selection.
Darwin built the logical architecture, and then the field spent the next century finding the evidence to fill the rooms.
Yes, Gilbert maintained that it is entirely proper, historically validated scientific methodology to state a robust theoretical framework based on logic first, before testing it with endless further elaborations.
But what about the tone? Did Gilbert apologize for being abrasive or for calling the field schizophrenic?
Not really. He fundamentally justified his brashness as a scientific necessity. He explicitly stated in his notes that he preferred being bold and forceful. Why? Because if his theory was fundamentally wrong, a bold, crystalline statement allows opponents to clearly and easily show why it is wrong. If he was timid or weak in his phrasing, opponents could simply misinterpret, ignore, or deflect the arguments. He wanted to provoke a clean, unavoidable fight over the data.
That is a fascinating philosophy of scientific advancement. Make your target as big, bright, and aggressively visible as possible so everyone can take a clean shot. If it survives the barrage, it's strong. If it dies quickly, and science moves on.
And he also pushed back fiercely on the crackpot label. He noted that other peer reviewers, specifically mentioning an anonymous reviewer who had read his initial drafts, had actually come to his defense against these exact types of philosophical criticisms and strongly recommended the paper for acceptance.
He had defenders inside the blind review process who saw the value, but clearly he entirely lost Zach Blount. How did this finally conclude?
Blount demanded that his name not be associated with the paper in any capacity whatsoever. He explicitly requested to be removed from the acknowledgments section.
And did Gilbert comply with that demand?
If you look at the final published 2020 paper in Rethinking Ecology, Zach Blount's name is entirely absent. Instead, in the acknowledgments, Gilbert thanks several named reviewers: Joel Lehman, Miguel Proa, Lars Hillstrom, and one anonymous reviewer.
So, despite the brutal reviews and the accusations, the paper ultimately gets published. The natural reward theory enters the scientific record, scarred but intact. Why put yourself through that? What drives a scientist to endure that level of professional friction?
Gilbert's justification for enduring all of this stems from a concept he calls the Darwinian double bind.
The double bind. What exactly is the contradiction there?
It is the core, unresolvable contradiction that Gilbert believes has haunted evolutionary biology for over a century. Darwin's strict theory insists that natural selection only yields comparative progress, meaning an organism only adapts to its immediate local environment, with absolutely no higher goal or directional trajectory. But simultaneously, anyone looking at the fossil record must recognize that life has shown absolute progress, a massive, directional historical increase in complexity and global innovative capacity over billions of years. We went from single cells to conscious mammals.
We observe directional advancement with our own eyes, but our primary theoretical framework explicitly forbids directional advancement. That is a massive bind.
Exactly. Gilbert felt that the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology was hopelessly trapped in this contradiction, forcing biologists into a schizophrenic state of having to accept both realities without a mathematical or physical mechanism to bridge them. He deeply believed it required a forceful, uncompromising, paradigm-shifting intervention, the introduction of a second deterministic macro force, natural reward, to finally resolve the contradiction and complete Darwin's unfinished framework.
Let's take a breath and zoom out on this entire journey. We have followed the evolution of this single scientific paper, tracing its path from a messy, conceptually heavy 2019 preprint to a highly streamlined, rigorous 2020 publication using Gilbert's changes document as our roadmap. We watched the theory shed its corporate economic skin and don a rigorous biological suit of armor, swapping out the Apple and McDonald's analogies for the complex realities of C-squared histocompatibility and the clunky evolution of C4 photosynthesis.
We saw it meticulously refine its language, adopting the specific concept of the blind entrepreneur to avoid the deadly philosophical trap of teleology, while stubbornly and aggressively holding the line on the struggle for supremacy to accurately describe the ruthless nature of ecological monopolies.
And we weathered the intense, highly personal storms of expert collaboration. We watched a simple, shared graphic mapping the genetic mutations of E. coli bacteria transform into a battleground for the very soul of evolutionary theory, resulting in accusations of crackpottery and a scrapped acknowledgement.
This story perfectly illustrates that the scientific method is not a sterile, frictionless machine outputting pristine facts. It is a profoundly human endeavor, driven by passion, stubbornness, philosophy, and a relentless, exhausting demand for better evidence.
Which brings us right back to where we started, that expectation of the clean eureka moment. We want scientific progress to be a straight, unbroken line of discovery. But as this deep dive shows, the line is incredibly jagged. It is built on bitter arguments, endless revisions, and sometimes permanently burned bridges. History loves to revere the lone genius who disrupts the status quo. We absolutely love the myth of the maverick scientist. But the modern scientific machine is fundamentally built on consensus, incremental data, and rigorous, often brutal peer review. When a new idea comes along, an idea like natural reward that is so vast it requires an entirely new vocabulary just to be conceptualized, it inevitably generates a massive visceral friction.
Like being compared to a creationist or called a crackpot by your own respected colleagues.
Exactly. So here's the question we want to leave you with as you go about your day. Is that intense friction, that visceral immune system-like rejection by the scientific establishment, a sign that the new idea is fundamentally flawed and unscientific? Or is that friction the exact necessary sound a paradigm makes right before it finally shifts?
Something to think about the next time you read a tidy scientific headline.
Thanks for diving deep with us.